Before we begin, remember this: humanity was not discovered as a threat, it was discovered as a question. In a silent observatory core, buried beneath ancient safeguards, one alert awakens for the first time in 300 cycles, and it chooses Earth.
The alert was never supposed to trigger. It had been built into the observatory core 300 cycles ago, buried beneath layers of higher reasoning protocols and diplomatic filters, a final safeguard reserved for civilizations that crossed a very specific threshold. Not technological, not territorial, something older, something harder to define. In all that time, it had never activated once. Until Earth. Archivist Thalen did not notice it at first. He was standing in Observation Chamber 12, watching a live feed projection of a small human settlement under late afternoon light. The scene was quiet in a way that always made him comfortable. Structures aligned with primitive efficiency, small figures moving with predictable purpose, nothing that suggested urgency or threat. Humanity, according to every classification metric, was progressing exactly as expected. Curious, social, transitional, safe. Behind him, the core began to rewrite its own conclusion. A thin line of amber text flickered across the auxiliary display, so faint it might have been dismissed as a calibration error. Thalen almost ignored it. Almost. But something about the phrasing held him. Classification override pending. He frowned, stepping closer. Overrides required council authorization. No system initiated them independently. He reached out, expanding the display, expecting a minor discrepancy in atmospheric readings or behavioral data. Instead, he saw a second line appear beneath it. Subject: Homo sapiens. There was a pause. Not mechanical. Not delayed processing. Pause that felt deliberate. Then the third line rendered. Reclassification. Incomplete. Thalen's fingers hovered over the console. That was not possible. The core did not leave classifications incomplete. It resolved them, categorized, definalized. That was its function. Behind the glass, the projection shifted focus automatically, zooming closer to ground level. A human child came into view. She could not have been more than 6 or 7 cycles old by their measurement conversion. Small, unremarkable. She stood in an open patch of dirt, holding a thin wooden stick in one hand. There was another human nearby, larger, older, watching but not intervening. The child raised the stick and swung. The motion was clumsy at first, inefficient, the kind of unrefined movement typical of early development stages. The stick struck a solid object, a stone, and the impact jolted back into her hand. She flinched. Thalen expected the sequence to end there. Pain avoidance was universal. It was one of the few constants across all cataloged life. But the child did not stop. She adjusted her grip, swung again, this time harder. The impact forced her backward. The stick slipped. She lost balance and fell onto the ground, scraping her arm along the rough surface. A visible reaction followed, the brief tightening of facial muscles, the sharp intake of breath. Pain registered, clearly. Still, she did not stop. She pushed herself upright, picked up the stick, and tried again. Thalen felt something unfamiliar move through his thoughts. Not quite concern, not quite confusion. He expanded the feed, isolating physiological data. The readings confirmed what he was seeing. Pain response, active. Damage markers, minor. Behavioral adjustment, present. Continuation probability, rising. The core updated behind him. Behavioral anomaly detected. Another pause. Then, pattern recognition. Recursive. Thalen turned slowly toward the main display, his earlier calm dissolving into something sharper. Recursive patterns were not unusual in intelligent species. Learning required repetition, trial and error, adaptation. But this felt different, because the system wasn't labeling it as learning. It was labeling it as persistence. The child struck the stone again. This time, the stick connected cleanly. A small fragment chipped off. She froze, staring at it, as if something had just revealed itself. Then she smiled. Behind Thalen, the core completed its override. Preliminary classification. self-reinforcing survival mechanism. The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication the system did not bother to explain. Thalen stared at them, then back at the child, then back at the words again, because for the first time in his career, the system had not told him what humanity was. It had only told him what it might become. And somewhere deep within the core's architecture, a secondary process, one that had never once been used, quietly initiated without permission. Fail-safe observation protocol engaged. No one had authorized that either. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether humanity was safe. It was why the system was afraid to decide.
So far, Archivist Thalen has watched something impossible unfold. A human child falls, bleeds, feels pain, and still tries again. The core does not call this simply learning, it calls it persistence, a self-reinforcing survival mechanism. But if Earth is still classified as safe, why has the observatory's deepest fail-safe already begun watching humanity like a threat?
The official classification did not change. By the time the alert reached the upper channels, it had already been softened, filtered, and translated into language the Council preferred: measured, rational, familiar. Humanity remained listed under Transitional Cooperative Species, a designation reserved for civilizations that had passed their most volatile developmental stage, but had not yet achieved full interstellar stability. In simpler terms, unpredictable, but not dangerous. Archivist Thalen stood in the central archive hall as the revised summary scrolled across the chamber's curved display. Around him, other analysts moved with quiet efficiency, reviewing data streams, cross-referencing behavioral logs, compiling long-range projections. No one appeared alarmed. No one even paused, which Thalen realized was the most unsettling part, because the core had never initiated a fail-safe protocol before. And yet, here they all were, treating it like a clerical adjustment. He accessed the internal logs directly, bypassing the public interface. The deeper layers still held the original phrasing, unedited and unapproved. He read the line again: self-reinforcing survival mechanism. It was not a classification any known species carried. Not even the most aggressive ones in recorded history. Thalen shifted the display, pulling up comparative models. Across the archive, species followed patterns. Conflict appeared early, peaked, then declined. Intelligence, given time and stability, always favored efficiency over destruction. Violence was wasteful. Cooperation scaled better. That was not theory. That was data. Hundreds of civilizations, thousands of cycles, all converging toward the same endpoint, which meant humanity should be doing the same. But the core had hesitated. He returned to the live feed projection. Earth rotated slowly beneath the observation grid, its surface lit by scattered clusters of artificial light. Communication signals pulsed across the atmosphere in layered networks. Dense, constant, interconnected. A global species, a talking species, a cooperating species. He expanded one of the data streams. Human networks carried information at extraordinary volume: news, research, art, entertainment, conversation. Entire systems dedicated not to survival, but to expression. That alone placed them firmly within expected developmental trajectories. But as he filtered deeper, another pattern emerged. Conflict simulations. They were everywhere. Structured competitions, strategic games, digital battlefields, physical contests. Environments where humans deliberately placed themselves into opposition. Not for survival, not for territory, for engagement, for improvement. Thalen isolated a cluster of data, a human training facility. Individuals subjected themselves to controlled stress, physical exhaustion, environmental hardship, simulated threat scenarios. Monitored, repeated, refined. He tagged the sequence for analysis. A junior analyst approached from across the chamber, her steps quick but measured. Lyris, recently assigned to behavioral mapping. Efficient, observant. Archivist, she said, inclining her head slightly. I reviewed your flagged anomaly. And? Thalen asked, not turning away from the display. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. It aligns with developmental variance. Transitional species often retain remnants of earlier survival behaviors. Remnants, Thalen repeated quietly. Lyris gestured toward the projection. Their environment required competition for resources. That pressure leaves cultural residue. It fades over time. Thalen finally looked at her. Does it? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. He redirected the display, layering historical data over present activity. Human conflict records stretched back across their entire documented timeline. Wars, skirmishes, internal disputes. Predictable. Expected. But what followed each conflict was not decline. It was acceleration. Technological leaps. Structural reorganizations. Expanded cooperation networks. Increased complexity. Each disruption seemed to push them forward rather than break them apart. Lyris studied the overlay, her expression tightening slightly. Correlation does not imply causation. No, Thalen agreed. But repetition suggests something else. He magnified the timeline, isolating intervals between major conflicts. The gaps were shrinking, not because conflict was increasing, but because recovery was accelerating. Adaptation cycles were compressing. Lyris folded her hands behind her back. Even so, their current trajectory is stable. Global communication, collaborative research, shared infrastructure, and persistent simulation of threat, Thalen interrupted. She paused again. That is not standard, he continued. Most species abandon conflict once stability is achieved. Humans appear to rehearse it. Lyris considered that. Preparation is not aggression. No, Thalen said slowly. But it is not abandonment either. The chamber lights dimmed briefly as a new data packet arrived from the core. Routine update. Automated. Thalen opened it. For a moment he said nothing. Lyris stepped closer. What is it? He rotated the display so she could see. A series of physiological markers. Human stress responses under controlled conditions. Elevated heart rate. Hormonal spike. And then, stabilization. Improvement. Cognitive function increased under sustained pressure. Decision-making speed enhanced. Motor coordination refined. Lyris frowned. That isn't consistent. No, Thalen said quietly. Across every species in the archive, stress degraded performance. It was a limiting factor, a biological safeguard. In humans, it appeared to be something else entirely. A catalyst. The core appended a single note beneath the data. Further classification required. Thalen stared at it, a slow realization forming. Because the system wasn't correcting itself. It was escalating its inquiry. And for the first time, Thalen began to suspect that the core wasn't struggling to define humanity. It was struggling to contain the implications. He turned back to Earth, watching the flicker of lights across its surface. A peaceful world by all visible measures. A cooperative species by every accepted model. And yet the deeper he looked, the more it felt like he was observing something still in motion. Something that hadn't finished becoming whatever it was meant to be. And whatever that was, the core had just admitted it did not understand it. The deeper layers were not meant to be accessed this often. That alone should have been enough to stop him. But Archivist Thalen found himself returning to them repeatedly, as if the data itself had created a gravity he could no longer step away from. Each pass through the human archive revealed something small, something easily dismissed in isolation, yet impossible to ignore when placed alongside everything else. It was not the scale of human conflict that unsettled him. It was the consistency. Across time, across geography, across cultures that had never interacted, the same behavioral structures appeared again and again. Different languages, different tools, different beliefs, but the underlying responses were identical. Pressure did not fragment them. It refined them. He isolated a cluster of records spanning several centuries, localized conflicts, regional collapses, global crises. In every case, the initial phase followed expectation. Chaos, loss, instability. Then came the deviation. Instead of prolonged breakdown, systems reorganized. Faster each time. Communication networks adapted. Resource distribution became more efficient. New technologies emerged not gradually, but in bursts, compressed development cycles that defied predictive modeling. Thalen ran the sequence again, adjusting for environmental variables. The result did not change. He expanded the analysis further back. Pre-industrial, pre-urban, pre-linguistic, the pattern remained, which was when the discomfort began to take shape into something more precise. Because the pattern was not reacting to conflict. It was responding to it, as if the stimulus itself was required. Behind him, the archive shifted to accommodate a new data request. Lyris had entered without announcement this time, her movements quicker than usual, her composure slightly less controlled. "I found something," she said. Thalen did not turn. "So did I." She stepped beside him and projected her findings onto the shared display. Physiological mapping. Human neural activity under stress conditions. He scanned the data, recognizing the markers immediately: adrenal spikes, cortisol release, heightened sensory processing. Standard biological responses. Except for what followed. The recovery curve. Instead of gradual normalization, the human system recalibrated rapidly, returning to baseline while retaining elevated efficiency. In some cases, surpassing previous performance levels entirely. Lyris pointed to the secondary response markers. "This shouldn't exist." Thalen's gaze narrowed. "Explain." "For most species, prolonged stress creates degradation, cognitive, physical, social. It accumulates." She adjusted the projection, overlaying comparative species data. "But humans, they clear it. Fast. And not just clear it, they convert it." "Convert it into what?" She hesitated, as if the answer resisted the structure of language itself. "Capacity," she said finally. The word lingered between them. Thalen leaned forward slightly, studying the sequence more closely. The implications unfolded with quiet inevitability. Then sustained pressure would not weaken them, he said. Lyris met his gaze. It would strengthen them. The chamber fell into a brief silence, broken only by the low hum of the archive systems. Thalen redirected the display again, this time pulling from cultural data rather than biological. Human narratives, recorded histories, personal accounts, survivors of extreme conditions, individuals exposed to prolonged hardship, war, isolation, loss. The expected outcome, according to every model, was decline. Instead, a recurring phenomenon appeared: adaptation, reconstruction, a restructuring of priorities, behaviors, and identity that resulted not in collapse, but in increased functionality. He highlighted a series of entries, each from a different region, a different time, a different context. The descriptions varied. The result did not. "They have a term for it," Lyris said quietly. Thalen did not look away from the screen. "What term?" She accessed the linguistic database, cross-referencing translations. Post-traumatic growth. The phrase settled into place with a weight neither of them could ignore. Growth. Not survival. Not recovery. Growth. Thalen exhaled slowly, though he was not aware of having held his breath. "That is not a corrective mechanism," he said. "No," Lyris agreed. "It's directional." He leaned back, the pieces aligning in a way that felt less like discovery and more like realization. Conflict did not interrupt human development. It accelerated it. And if that was true, then every assumption the Council had made was built on a flawed premise. Lyris shifted the display again, bringing up a different dataset. Behavioral simulations. Humans engaging in structured competition, not for resources, not for survival, but for improvement. Strategic games, physical contests, cooperative problem-solving under artificial constraints. "They recreate pressure conditions voluntarily," she said. Thalen nodded slowly. "They practice it." The words felt heavier than they should have, because practice implied preparation. For something. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Then the core updated again. This time the alert was not subtle. The main display dimmed, replaced by a single line of text. Long-term projection recalibration in progress. Thalen's attention sharpened immediately. Predictive models rarely required recalibration unless new variables had been introduced. He opened the projection file. The initial model appeared as expected, humanity stabilizing, expanding gradually, integrating into broader interstellar frameworks. Then the recalibrated model loaded. For a moment, he did not understand what he was seeing. The curve did not smooth. It spiked. Growth rates increased under simulated stress conditions. Technological advancement accelerated. Social cohesion strengthened. The more pressure applied, the more rapidly the system evolved. Lyris stepped closer, her voice lower now. That's not a development curve. Thalen closed the file slowly. No, he said. It's a feedback loop. The realization settled between them, heavy and irreversible. Because feedback loops required input. And if conflict was the input, then any external pressure introduced to humanity would not suppress it. It would amplify it. Thalen turned back toward Earth, the distant world still glowing softly beneath the observation grid. For the first time, it no longer looked like a species approaching stability. It looked like a system waiting to be tested. And somewhere deep within the observatory core, the recalibration process completed. A final note appeared beneath the projection. Uncontrolled escalation risk. High. Thalen read it once. Then again. Because the system wasn't warning about humanity. It was warning about what would happen if someone pushed them. The decision was made faster than it should have been. That, more than anything else, would be questioned later. In the council chamber, where conclusions were usually carved out through long deliberation and layered consensus, the vote passed with unusual efficiency. Not because the situation demanded urgency, at least not outwardly, but because nothing in the data appeared to justify hesitation. Humanity was still contained within a single system, still lacking interstellar capability, still, by every conventional measure, manageable. The recalibration warnings had been noted, of course. Filed, discussed, contextualized. But warnings without precedent were easy to reinterpret. The core had flagged anomalies before. None had ever resulted in escalation beyond standard protocol. So the Council chose the safer assumption. Humanity was unstable but not dangerous, which meant control was still possible. Archivist Thalen stood at the edge of the chamber as the final authorization sealed. His attention fixed not on the Council members, but on the projection hovering at the center of the room. Earth rotated slowly within it, serene and distant, its surface marked by faint constellations of artificial light. It looked unchanged, which made the decision feel even more misplaced. They are reacting to incomplete data, Lyris said quietly beside him. Thalen did not respond immediately. No, he said after a moment. They are reacting to familiar data. She turned slightly toward him. That's worse. Across the chamber, the lead counselor issued the formal directive. Initiate first contact protocol. The words carried the weight of centuries of precedent. Every known species had been approached this way. Structured communication, translation systems, controlled engagement. It had always worked. Even the most volatile civilizations had stabilized once dialogue began. Because communication resolved uncertainty. And uncertainty, historically, was the root of conflict. Thalen wanted to believe that still applied. But the core had not been uncertain. It had been cautious. The contact vessel entered the outer edge of the human system within a standard observational window. Invisible to human detection, its systems began compiling real-time linguistic data, feeding it into the translation matrix. Every intercepted signal, spoken, written, encoded, was processed, mapped, and contextualized. Within hours, the system reached functional fluency. Within 12, it initiated transmission. The message was precise, neutral, carefully constructed to avoid any implication of threat or dominance. It introduced the Council, acknowledged humanity's development, and extended an offer of peaceful dialogue, a simple beginning, the kind that had worked hundreds of times before. On Earth, the response began almost immediately, not in words, in movement. Across multiple regions, defense networks activated in near-perfect synchronization. Satellite arrays shifted position. Communication channels rerouted into encrypted clusters. Military infrastructure, previously dormant, adjusted to elevated readiness without a single centralized command. It happened too quickly, too cleanly. Thalen watched the data stream update in real time, his earlier unease sharpening into something far more focused. They understood it, Lyris said. Yes, Thalen replied. She glanced at him. Then why? Because they didn't trust it. The realization settled between them with quiet certainty. The message had been translated correctly, but meaning had not been preserved. Subtle linguistic structures, phrases intended to convey openness, had shifted just enough in translation to suggest something else. Something closer to intrusion, observation, approach, contact. To the Council, it was an invitation. To humanity, it appeared to be a declaration. Across Earth, no public broadcast acknowledged the message directly. No global address. No visible panic. Just silence. Not absence of activity. Controlled absence of exposure. They're containing the information, Lyris said. Or controlling its spread, Thalen added. He expanded the communication map. Beneath the surface silence, data traffic surged. Massive volumes of encrypted transmission flowed between networks, governments, institutions. Deliberation, coordination, preparation. The core flagged the pattern automatically. Collective response efficiency elevated. Thalen felt a tightening in his chest, because this was not the behavior of a species caught off guard. It was the behavior of a species assessing a threat. The Council, however, interpreted it differently. In their framework, rapid defensive posture indicated fear. Predictable reaction. One that could be corrected through demonstration. Clarity through power. The secondary directive followed within the cycle. Authorize controlled display. Thalen closed his eyes briefly. That's a mistake, Lyris said under her breath. He didn't disagree. The contact vessel repositioned, aligning its systems toward Earth's moon. The target was deliberate, uninhabited, visible, symbolically significant. A demonstration without casualties. A statement of capability without direct harm. Precision, restraint, control. At least that was the intention. The strike executed flawlessly. A concentrated energy discharge impacted the lunar surface, producing a burst of light visible across Earth's night side. The explosion carved a clean, unmistakable mark into the terrain. A message written in physics. We are stronger. We choose not to use it against you. For several seconds after the strike, the human system remained unchanged. Then, everything stopped. Not the networks. Not the data flow. The noise. Broadcast channels went silent. Public communication dropped to near zero. What remained was invisible to standard observation. Deep channels, encrypted pathways, hidden infrastructure. The core registered the shift immediately. Behavioral pattern deviation. Thalen leaned forward, eyes locked on the display. This was not panic. It was not collapse. It was containment. The silence stretched. Minutes became hours. Hours became a full planetary cycle. And still, no response. Lyris spoke first. What are they doing? Thalen didn't answer right away, because the pattern was becoming familiar. He had seen it before. In the data, in the models, in every sequence where pressure was applied. They're thinking, he said finally. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't enough. Because thinking didn't require this level of coordination, this level of precision, this level of silence. He adjusted the sensor filters, pushing deeper into the system. What he found made him go still. Production lines activating. Resource chains redirecting. Facilities repurposing. Not randomly. Not reactively. Deliberately. At scale. They're not just thinking, Thalen said, his voice quieter now. Lyris followed his gaze, her expression tightening. They're preparing. The core updated again, its tone unchanged, its implication far heavier. Unobserved activity increase. Significant. The silence continued, and for the first time since the strike, the question shifted. Not how humanity would respond, but when. Because whatever answer they were preparing, it was not going to be immediate, and it was not going to be simple. The silence broke, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no broadcast, no declaration, no demand. What arrived instead was a single object. It appeared at the edge of the observation perimeter without warning, slipping past detection thresholds that had been calibrated to track everything from debris to directed weaponry. For a fraction of a second, the sensors failed to categorize it. Not because it was invisible, but because it did not match any known pattern. Then it resolved. A vessel. Human. Small by every measurable standard. Its structure was uneven, its surface layered with materials that did not belong to a single design philosophy. It looked assembled rather than engineered, its geometry practical rather than elegant. And yet, it had crossed the perimeter. Phelan stared at the projection, his mind struggling to reconcile the contradiction. They shouldn't be able to reach this far, Lyris said, her voice low but steady. They shouldn't, Phelan agreed, but it had. And more importantly, it had done so without triggering a defensive response. The picket systems had registered its presence too late. Not because it was faster than expected, but because it had approached along a vector that exploited a narrow gap in sensor coverage. One so minor it had never been considered tactically relevant. A gap that had never been used before. Coincidence? Lyris asked. Phelan didn't answer, because he had already seen the pattern. Nothing about humanity was coincidental anymore. The vessel slowed as it approached the contact station, aligning itself with deliberate precision. No weapon signatures, no active shielding beyond minimal structural reinforcement. No signs of aggression, just one life form inside. A single human. The request came through moments later, transmitted in broken but functional translation. I will speak with whoever is in charge. The phrasing was imperfect. The intent was not. Across the chamber, the council convened again, their earlier confidence now tempered by something less certain. This was not how first contact unfolded. Species did not breach observation perimeters. They did not arrive uninvited. They did not choose the terms of engagement. And yet, humanity had just done all three. Phelan watched as the internal debate unfolded in real time. Some argued for immediate containment. Others for cautious engagement. A few, very few, recommended withdrawal. But the majority still leaned on precedent. They had seen resistance before. They had seen fear. They had seen misinterpretation. This, they believed, was simply another variation. The decision was made. Allow controlled contact. The human was escorted into the diplomatic chamber within the station. Every movement was tracked, every biometric monitored, every variable accounted for. Phelan observed from the upper tier, his attention fixed on the figure as it entered. The human was physically unremarkable. Medium height, compact build. No visible augmentations. No external indicators of status or rank beyond subtle variations in attire. But there was something else. Something harder to quantify. Stillness. Not the absence of movement. The absence of unnecessary movement. The human's posture was relaxed, but not passive. Controlled. Deliberate. As if every motion had already been decided before it was executed. Lyris leaned slightly closer. He's not reacting. Phelan nodded. Because there was nothing in the human's behavior that suggested uncertainty. Or fear. Which, given the context, should have been impossible. The lead diplomat initiated the exchange. Her tone measured, her posture open. We welcome you, she said, the translation system carrying her words across the gap. Our intention is peaceful contact. The human listened without interruption. Then he spoke. You fired on our moon. The words were simple, flat, unembellished. The translation carried them cleanly this time, but the weight behind them did not require interpretation. It was a demonstration, the diplomat replied. A controlled action to establish dominance, the human said. Not a question. Correction. The room shifted subtly, not physically, conceptually, because the framing had just changed. The diplomat adjusted, recalibrating her response. It was not intended as aggression. The human studied her for a moment. And the observation? He asked. Was that not aggression either? A pause. The diplomat hesitated only slightly, but enough. It was standard protocol, she said. For how long? The human asked. 6 of your years. The human nodded once, as if confirming something already known. You watched us, he said. Without consent. Without contact. Then you announced yourselves in a way that implied approach. Then you demonstrated your ability to destroy something we value. He stopped there. Not because he had finished. Because he didn't need to continue. The implication filled the space between them. And you expected us, he added quietly, to interpret that as peaceful. No one spoke for a moment. Thalen felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but irreversible. Because this was not a misunderstanding. It was a reframing. The diplomat opened her mouth to respond, but the human continued before she could. We did not respond immediately, he said. You noticed that. Yes, she replied carefully. Do you know why? Another pause. No, she admitted. The human's gaze did not change. Because we were deciding whether you were a problem. The words landed with quiet precision. No threat, no escalation, just clarity. Lyris inhaled softly beside Thalen, because in that moment the dynamic inverted. The human was not here to negotiate from weakness. He was here to evaluate. The diplomat straightened slightly, her composure holding, but just barely. And your conclusion? The human's expression did not shift. We are still deciding. The room felt smaller. Thalen's attention flickered briefly to the data streams updating in real time. Earth's activity had not slowed. If anything, it had increased. Production rates rising. Coordination tightening. Systems evolving. All while this single individual stood in front of them, speaking calmly, without urgency, without pressure, as if time itself was not a factor, which meant, whatever humanity was preparing, it did not depend on this conversation. The diplomat tried once more, her voice steady but edged now with something less certain. We are prepared to establish terms of cooperation. The human considered that, then asked a question that did not belong in any diplomatic framework the council had ever used. Why should we trust you? There was no immediate answer. Not because one didn't exist, because none of the available answers were sufficient. Thalen felt the weight of that realization settle into place. Because trust in every prior encounter had been assumed as the endpoint. Here, it was the barrier. And for the first time since the process began, Thalen understood something with absolute clarity. This was not first contact. This was assessment. And humanity was not the subject. They were. The human stepped back slightly, the motion controlled, deliberate. This conversation, he said, is not your opportunity. A brief pause. It's yours. Then he turned and walked out. No escalation, no demand, no visible consequence, just departure. But as the chamber doors closed behind him, Thalen felt something shift again. Deeper this time, harder to name, because the question had changed. It was no longer whether humanity would respond. It was whether this had already been their response. And somewhere far below the station, in systems no one had thought to monitor closely enough, human activity crossed a threshold. Quietly, irreversibly, and still, no one knew what they were building. The first engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. It was logged, archived, and summarized before most of the council had even processed that it had begun. A cluster of human vessels, small, irregular, poorly shielded, intercepted a patrol unit near the outer boundary of their system. The outcome, by every predictive model, was inevitable. The alien fleet held superior firepower, superior range, superior coordination. The exchange unfolded exactly as expected. Human ships were destroyed. The patrol sustained minimal damage. The report concluded with a single phrase. Engagement resolved. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it. But the second engagement occurred 9 hours later. And it did not follow the model. Thalen stood in the observation chamber as the footage replayed, his focus narrowing with each frame. The human vessels approached along a trajectory that defied standard engagement logic. Not head-on, not evasive, but angled through a gravitational distortion that should have reduced their maneuverability. Instead, it concealed them. "They're using the environment," Lyris said, her voice quieter now, more measured. "They shouldn't know how," Thalen replied. The patrol adjusted formation, responding with precise counterfire. 2 human ships were eliminated instantly. The third did not retreat. It accelerated, directly into the formation. For a fraction of a second, Thalen expected impact. A final, desperate maneuver. Instead, the vessel released a cascade of metallic debris, fragmented components, structural remnants, pieces that had no clear purpose. The debris spread outward, disrupting targeting systems just long enough. Long enough for the remaining human ships to reposition. The patrol recovered quickly. The advantage remained overwhelming. But the engagement had changed, because the humans had not fought to win. They had fought to observe, to test, to learn. The Corps updated the tactical analysis in real time. Pattern deviation confirmed. Thalen felt the words settle into something heavier than data, because deviation implied direction, and direction implied intention. The third engagement came sooner, and this time, the patrol lost a ship. It happened near the boundary of a planetary orbit, where gravitational forces created minor distortions in sensor clarity. The human vessels, fewer now, reduced by prior losses, entered the engagement already damaged, already compromised, and yet they did not hesitate. "They're not preserving assets," Lyris said, her eyes fixed on the display. "No," Thalen agreed. "They're prioritizing outcome." The lead human vessel absorbed 2 direct strikes. Hull integrity collapsed in sections. Internal systems failed. By all known metrics, it should have disengaged or been destroyed. Did neither. It continued forward, functioning beyond its expected limits. Thalen felt a slow, rising tension tighten across his thoughts, because he had seen this before. Not in machines, in biology. The vessel reached the center of the formation and deployed a focused energy burst, not powerful enough to destroy, but precise enough to disable propulsion systems in 2 alien ships simultaneously. The remaining human vessels closed the gap, finished the engagement, and were destroyed seconds later. The exchange was recorded as a tactical anomaly. 1 ship lost, 2 damaged, human losses total. From a strategic perspective, it was insignificant. From a predictive perspective, it was catastrophic. "They're adapting," Lyris said. Thalen did not respond, because adapting was too small a word. Across the next several cycles, the pattern accelerated. Human engagements increased in frequency, but not in scale. Small units, limited numbers, high losses, but each encounter introduced something new. A different approach vector, a different use of terrain, a different sequence of actions. They were not repeating themselves. They were iterating. The Corps struggled to maintain accurate projections. Model instability increasing. Thalen expanded the long-range analysis, comparing engagement data across time. The progression was undeniable. Human response time decreased. Coordination improved. Effectiveness increased. And most critically, the rate of change was accelerating. "They're not just learning," Lyris said, her voice tightening. "They're sharing the learning." Thalen pulled up the communication intercepts. Encrypted, layered, distributed across multiple networks. Data moving faster than engagement cycles. Every encounter feeding into the next. Every loss becoming information. "They don't need central command," he said slowly. "They are the command." The implication settled heavily between them, because that structure did not exist in any known military system. It was not hierarchical. It was not fixed. It was adaptive, like a living system. The Council responded as expected. They increased force allocation. Additional fleets were deployed. Formation density increased. Engagement protocols adjusted to account for human variability. On paper, the advantage remained absolute. But Thalen no longer trusted the paper, because the numbers told only part of the story, and the part they did not capture was growing. He isolated a single variable within the data: human production rates. At first, it appeared negligible. Replacement vessels entering the system at a slow but steady pace. Then the curve shifted, subtly at first, then sharply. "They're building," Lyris said. Thalen nodded, his focus tightening further. But not at a linear rate. The data updated again. Facilities expanding. Supply chains reorganizing. Manufacturing processes accelerating under sustained pressure. "They're scaling with conflict," he said. Lyris turned to him. "That's not possible." "It is for them." The realization settled with quiet inevitability. Conflict was not depleting their capacity. It was increasing it. The core flagged the trend. Resource utilization efficiency rising. Thalen closed his eyes briefly, because the pattern was complete now. Biology, psychology, culture, infrastructure, all aligned toward the same response. Pressure in, capability out. He opened his eyes again, returning to the display. Earth no longer looked like a developing civilization. It looked like a system in motion, a system that had been waiting for this. The next engagement report arrived. Thalen did not need to read it to understand what it would contain. Another deviation, another adjustment, another step forward. He accessed the summary anyway, and felt the final piece fall into place. Human tactical doctrine updated. He stared at the line, then at the timestamp, because the update had occurred during the engagement, not after, not between cycles. In real time, Lyris exhaled slowly. They're rewriting their strategy while they're still fighting. Thalen nodded once. Yes, the word felt insufficient, because strategy required planning. This was something else, something faster, something deeper. He looked back at the broader projection. Fleet numbers still favored the Council, by every measurable margin. But the shape of the conflict had changed, and for the first time, the outcome was no longer predictable. The core updated one final time. Projection confidence. Degrading. Thalen read the line carefully, then again, because the system was not saying humanity would win. It was saying it no longer knew who would, and that uncertainty was growing. The realization did not arrive as a single moment. It accumulated, slowly, relentlessly, until it could no longer be ignored. Archivist Thalen stood alone in the lower analysis chamber. The lights dimmed to accommodate the scale of data projected across the walls. Biological records, behavioral models, historical reconstructions, cultural archives. Every layer of human existence laid out in parallel. At first glance, it was chaos. At second glance, it was alignment. He had spent cycles searching for the point where humanity diverged from known patterns, the moment where they became something else. But the deeper he looked, the more unsettling the truth became. There was no divergence, no shift, no transition. They had always been this way. Lyris entered quietly, her presence almost lost beneath the weight of the projections. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. She could see it. "You found it," she said finally. Thalen nodded once. "Or it found us." He expanded the oldest dataset, fragments of early human existence reconstructed from incomplete records, primitive tools, bone structures, environmental pressures. The conditions were clear. They had not been the strongest, not the fastest, not the most naturally equipped. Everything in their environment had been better suited to survival, which meant they shouldn't have survived at all. But they did, and not by overcoming those disadvantages, by adapting to them. "They were hunted," Lyris said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thalen inclined his head. Constantly, he shifted the projection again, overlaying predator distributions with human migration patterns. The result was immediate and undeniable. Where predators dominated, humans followed, not avoiding, not retreating, following. They didn't escape pressure, Thalen said slowly. They stayed inside it. Lyris felt something tighten in her chest. Why? Thalen did not answer right away, because the answer was already there. In the data, in the patterns, in everything they had seen over the last cycles. Because that's where they function best. The words settled into the room with quiet finality. He moved forward in the timeline. Weapons appeared before agriculture, before permanent shelter, before written language. The first things they built were not tools for living, but tools for surviving something that wanted them dead. Lyris shook her head slightly. That doesn't make sense. It does, Thalen replied. He pulled up the biological data again, stress responses, hormonal regulation, neural adaptation. For every other species, prolonged threat creates a limit, a ceiling. Eventually, the system fails. He highlighted the human data. They don't have that ceiling. Lyris stared at the projection, her earlier certainty dissolving into something colder. They get stronger. Yes. More focused. Yes. More coordinated. Yes. She swallowed. That's not a flaw. Thalen looked at her. No. It's a design. Silence filled the chamber, because design implied intention, and intention implied inevitability. Lyris turned back to the broader data set, her thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces she had been avoiding. The social structures, she said. Every other species fractures under sustained conflict. Thalen nodded. They consolidate. He brought up the communication patterns from the war. Global coordination, distributed command, rapid adaptation. They don't break apart, Lyris said. They tighten. Thalen's voice lowered. They become more. The implication was unavoidable now. Every escalation, every loss, every increase in pressure was feeding the same response. Enhancement. He closed the biological file and opened the conflict projections again. Fleet numbers, production rates, doctrinal shifts. Human vessels had increased from scattered resistance to coordinated formations, from improvised tactics to calculated strikes, from reaction to anticipation. They're not just responding to us anymore, Lyris said. No, Thalen agreed. They're predicting us. The core updated again, its tone unchanged, its meaning devastating. Enemy modeling accuracy increasing. Lyris let out a slow breath. We taught them. Thalen's gaze remained fixed on the display. Yes, every engagement had been a lesson. Every tactic used against them had been analyzed, absorbed, and improved upon. The Council had escalated force, believing it would end the conflict faster. Instead, it had accelerated human development. Lyris turned to him, something close to fear now visible in her expression. Then what happens if we escalate further? Thalen did not hesitate. They adapt faster. And if we commit overwhelming force? They adapt to that. Her voice dropped. And if we don't stop? Thalen finally looked away from the display. Then they won't either. The words hung between them, because this was no longer a question of victory. It was a question of trajectory. And humanity's trajectory was exponential. The chamber doors opened abruptly behind them. A council messenger entered, urgency breaking through their usual composure. Archivist, they said, voice tight. You are required in the main chamber. Immediately. Thalen didn't ask why. He already knew. The shift had reached the council. They walked in silence through the corridor, the hum of the station louder than usual, or perhaps just more noticeable now. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere had changed. Gone was the calm certainty. In its place, tension, not panic. Something sharper, more focused. Fleet Commander Rethan stood at the center display, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the incoming data. Thalen stepped forward. What happened? Rethan didn't turn. They changed again. The display updated. Human formations. New configurations. Unfamiliar patterns. They're no longer reacting to our movements, Rethan continued. They're moving before we do. Lyris felt her breath catch. That's not possible. Redhan finally looked at them. It is if they understand us better than we understand them. Thalen stepped closer to the display, scanning the data. And then he saw it. The pattern. The structure behind the movement. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was coherent. They've mapped us, he said quietly. Rethan's expression darkened. Yes. Silence fell across the chamber, because that changed everything. If humanity understood their behavior, their systems, their responses, then the advantage of scale meant nothing, because scale without unpredictability was vulnerability. Redhan exhaled slowly. We are preparing a full-scale deployment. Lyris turned sharply. That will only accelerate them. We don't have a choice. Thalen's voice cut through the tension. Yes, we do. All eyes shifted to him. He held their gaze steady. We stop. Rethan's expression hardened. Stopping now shows weakness. No, Thalen said. It shows understanding. The room remained silent, because this was the breaking point, not of the war, but of perception. Redhan looked back at the display, at the shifting human formations, at the data that no longer aligned with any known model. For the first time, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, Thalen saw it. Not fear, recognition. Because somewhere beneath the numbers, beneath the strategy, beneath the assumptions, the truth had finally surfaced. They were not fighting a species that could be overwhelmed. They were fighting a system that improved under attack. And the more force they applied, the stronger it would become. Redhan spoke again, his voice quieter now. If we stop, Thalen answered before he could finish. They decide what happens next. Another silence, heavier this time, because that was the cost. Not defeat, control. The chamber lights dimmed as a new transmission began to form on the central display. Incoming signal. Human origin. No encryption. No delay. Thalen felt his pulse slow, sharpen, because whatever came next would not be a reaction. It would be a decision, and they were no longer the ones making it.
By now, the Council's mistake is clear. They pushed humanity and humanity did not collapse. Every battle became data. Every loss became strategy. Thalen and Lyris have uncovered the truth. Humans grow under pressure. Now a signal from Earth is arriving, not as a reaction, but as a decision. And what humanity says next may end the war or redefine power itself.
The message did not begin with demands. It did not begin with threats. It began with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the deliberate absence of urgency. A pause long enough to force attention, long enough to make every individual in the chamber aware that whatever followed was not rushed, not reactive, not driven by fear. It was chosen. The signal stabilized across the display, and the human figure appeared once again, the same individual who had stood in their chamber days before. His posture was unchanged. His expression carried the same controlled stillness. But something beneath it had shifted. Not anger, not hostility. Resolution. You escalated, he said, his voice steady, the translation now flawless. We adapted. No accusation, just sequence. Redhan remained still, his gaze fixed on the projection. And now, the humans studied him for a moment, as if measuring something beyond the words themselves. Now, he said, you stop. The simplicity of it struck harder than any threat could have. Because it was not framed as a request, or even a command. It was a condition. Lyris felt the weight of it settle into place. Not dominance, not submission. Boundary. Redhan straightened slightly. You believe you can enforce that? The question carried the last remnants of the old framework. The assumption that power had to be demonstrated to exist. The human did not react immediately. Instead, the display shifted. Behind him, a secondary feed activated. At first, it was difficult to understand what they were seeing. Then the scale resolved. Human vessels. Hundreds of them. Then more. Formation after formation, arranged not in rigid structure, but in layered, adaptive clusters that shifted subtly even as they watched. Not static. Not fixed. Alive with adjustment. Lyris felt her breath catch. Because this was not the scattered resistance they had been tracking. This was organization, scale. Your projections are outdated, the human said calmly. The core updated in real time, struggling to reconcile the new data. Fleet numbers adjusted, then adjusted again, then failed to stabilize. Production capacity exceeded predictive limits, the system reported. Thalen closed his eyes briefly, because this was the inevitable conclusion of everything they had discovered. Pressure applied. Capacity increased, until the system itself could no longer contain it. Redhan did not look away from the display. You've built this in weeks. Yes. How? The human's expression did not change. We were already building. The answer was simple, but the implication was vast. This was not a reaction. It was acceleration. The war had not created this capability. It had unlocked it. Thalen stepped forward slightly, his voice quieter, more measured. You could have escalated further, he said. The human turned his attention to him. We could have. And you didn't. A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. Escalation was an option, the human said. Not a goal. The distinction settled heavily across the chamber, because it revealed something they had not accounted for. Control. Not just of systems. Not just of strategy. Of themselves. Redhan exhaled slowly. Then what do you want? The question hung in the air, stripped of assumption now. The human answered without delay. Clarity. The display shifted again. The fleet remained visible, but new data layered over it. Engagement logs, tactical adaptations, projected outcomes. We are not what you thought we were, he continued. And you are not what we hoped you were. A quiet, deliberate statement. Balanced. Measured. We don't require dominance, he said. We require understanding. Lyris felt something shift inside her at that. Because this was not the language of conquest. It was the language of boundaries drawn by something that knew exactly how far it could go. And chose not to. Rethan's voice lowered. And if we don't agree? The human held his gaze. Then you continue, he said. A pause. And so do we. No escalation. No dramatics. Just inevitability. Thalen understood then with absolute clarity. Humanity was not dangerous because it sought conflict. It was dangerous because it did not need to avoid it, could endure it, adapt to it, grow within it, and walk away from it, if it chose to. Redhan straightened fully now, the last traces of resistance settling into something else. Recognition. You're offering terms, he said. The human inclined his head slightly. We're offering a choice. The chamber fell silent again. But this silence was different. Not tension. Not uncertainty. Decision. Thalen watched the council members. Watched the shift ripple through them as the realization took hold. The old framework no longer applied. There was no path to victory that did not make humanity stronger. No escalation that did not accelerate their growth. No pressure that did not feed the system. The only variable left was intent. Redhan spoke, his voice steady now. We withdraw. The words carried across the chamber, final and irreversible. Not defeat. Recognition. The human nodded once. That's a start. The transmission ended without ceremony. No confirmation. No reinforcement. Just absence. Because none was needed. The outcome had already been decided the moment understanding replaced assumption. The fleets began to reposition almost immediately, withdrawal protocols initiating across the system. The core recalibrated its projections one final time. Conflict trajectory. De-escalating. Thalen stood in the quiet that followed, his gaze drifting back toward the distant image of Earth. It looked the same as it always had. Calm. Luminous. Unchanged. But now, he understood what lay beneath it. Not a species defined by war. Not a civilization trapped in violence. Something far more complex. A system shaped by survival so deeply that pressure itself became fuel. A species that did not break under strain, but refined itself through it. Lyris stepped beside him, her voice softer now. What do we call them? Thalen considered the question. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "We don't." She turned to him, confused. He looked back at the data, at the patterns, at the impossible alignment of biology, psychology, and behavior that no single word could contain. "Because the moment we think we've defined them," he said, "we'll be wrong again." Beyond the station, human fleets held position at the edge of their system. Not advancing, not retreating, watching, waiting, not for orders, for choice. And somewhere on a distant world beneath a yellow star, billions of individuals continued their lives, building, learning, competing, creating, unaware that, for the first time in recorded history, an entire civilization had looked at them and understood something simple. Humanity had never been fragile. It had only ever been underestimated.
And that is the lesson of humanity in this story. Thalian civilization believed strength meant control, prediction, and superiority, but Earth revealed another kind of power: endurance, adaptation, restraint, and choice. Humanity was never fragile. It was species forged by pressure, redefined by survival, and most dangerous when underestimated.